good evening, and welcome to the Sleep to Lore series. Tonight, we begin a long journey into two worlds, following the story of a boy named Jack Sawyer from Stephen King's epic novels The Talisman and Black House. We will start with his childhood in a fading hotel on the coast of New Hampshire, where a desperate quest is about to begin. If you enjoy these long explorations of story and lore, please consider subscribing to the channel or leaving a comment. It helps more than you know. Before we begin, I have a question for you. If you had to go on a long journey to find one magical object, what would you want that object to do? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now settle in and let us travel back to a quiet seaside town where our story begins. Chapter 1. A Boy's Desperate Bargain. Our story starts not with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent sound of the Atlantic Ocean whispering against the shore of New Hampshire. It is late September, and the air carries the first real chill of autumn, a promise of the harsh winter to come. Here, in a place meant for summer crowds and cheerful noise, a profound silence has settled. We are at the Alhambra Inn and Gardens, a grand old hotel that has seen far better days. Its white paint is peeling, revealing the greying wood beneath like bones showing through skin. The wide verandas, built for sipping cool drinks on hot afternoons, are empty now, populated only by a few lonely rocking chairs that sway and creak in the salty wind. The season is over. The tourists have gone home, and the Alhambra is preparing to shut its doors until next summer. It feels like a place holding its breath, waiting for an ending. Inside this cavernous, empty hotel lives a boy. His name is Jack Sawyer, and he is 12 years old. But in the way he carries himself, in the worry that pinches the corners of his eyes, he seems much older. Jack is tall for his age and thin, a boy who has maybe grown too fast, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own body. He is at that awkward age where childhood is a rapidly shrinking shoreline in the rearview mirror, and the vast, unknown territory of being a man lies ahead. For Jack, however, that territory is shrouded in a fog of fear and grief because his mother is dying. Her name is Lily Cavanaugh. Once, she was a star, not a giant of the silver screen, but a beloved figure nonetheless. They called her the Queen of the Bees, the leading lady in a dozen thrilling low-budget horror and science fiction films. She had a kind of luminous beauty that the camera adored, and a scream that could curdle milk. Jack has seen all her movies, sometimes watching them late at night on the hotel's old television. He sees her as she was, vibrant, alive, running from aliens, or confronting mad scientists with a brave set of her jaw. He sees her laughing in interviews, her hair perfect, her smile radiant. That woman is a ghost now, a flickering image on a screen. The woman in the suite upstairs is a pale, fragile stranger. The cancer that is consuming her is relentless. It has stolen her energy, her appetite, and the light from her eyes. It has made her paranoid and terrified, prone to sudden fits of weeping or long, vacant silences. She is afraid of everything now, the strange noises the old hotel makes at night, the shadows in the corners of her room, and most of all, she is afraid of Morgan Sloat. Morgan Sloat was Jack's father's business partner. Jack's father, Phil Sawyer, had died in a supposed hunting accident years ago, an event that had always felt wrong to Jack, a story with missing pages. After his death, Morgan Sloat had become a constant, looming presence in their lives. He managed Lily's money, or what was left of it. He had moved them from California to this empty hotel in New Hampshire, claiming the sea air would be good for her. But Jack sees the truth. He sees the way Morgan looks at his mother, a look that is not filled with concern, but with a cold, possessive hunger. He sees the way Morgan's presence seems to make his mother shrink, to make her sicker. Morgan Sloat is not a friend. He is a predator, circling, waiting. Jack feels a deep, instinctual hatred for the man, a hatred that feels ancient and profound, as if he has known for 1,000 lifetimes that Morgan Sloat is his enemy. Every day is the same for Jack. He wakes up early, checks on his mother, and then walks. He walks for miles, his hands shoved in his pockets, his mind a churning sea of worry. He walks along the beach, watching the gulls and the grey waves, feeling as empty and vast as the autumn sky. His whole world has shrunk to the size of his mother's sick room. He feels trapped, helpless. The adults around him, the hotel staff, the few remaining guests, they all look at him with pity, but no one can help. The doctors have given up. They speak in hushed tones about making her comfortable. Jack knows what that means. It means waiting for the end. But there is something else inside Jack, a secret part of him that he rarely acknowledges, even to himself. Sometimes, when the world feels particularly grim, he has what he calls daydreams. They are not ordinary daydreams. They come upon him suddenly, vividly. The world around him seems to shimmer and change. The light softens, the colors grow deeper and richer. The air smells different, cleaner, full of the scent of enormous forests and strange, sweet flowers. He catches glimpses of a different sky, a sky with 2 moons. He hears snatches of music he has never heard before. In these moments, he feels a strange sense of homecoming, a pang of longing for a place he is certain he has never been. These daydreams are his only escape, but they also frighten him. They feel too real. He worries that perhaps he is going crazy, that the stress and the grief are fracturing his mind. He worries that he is becoming like his mother, lost in a world of shadows and fear. It is on one of these long, lonely walks that his life changes forever. He wanders away from the Alhambra, past the closed-down saltwater taffy shops and shuttered arcades of Hampton Beach. He finds himself in a place that is even more desolate than the hotel, the skeletal remains of the Arcadia Fun World, an abandoned amusement park. The roller coaster is a silent, rusting spine against the sky. The Ferris wheel is a frozen circle of empty chairs. The painted smiles on the funhouse clowns are peeling and grotesque. The entire place hums with a feeling of departed joy, of laughter long since faded into the sea mist. And it is here, amidst the ghosts of summer fun, that he meets a man. The man is old, black, and pushing a maintenance cart filled with rags and bottles of cleaning solution. He is singing a song, a bluesy, rambling tune about a pretty girl and a long journey. The man's name is Lester Speedy Parker. To any other kid, he would just be a janitor, a forgotten employee, cleaning up a forgotten park. But to Jack, from the very first moment he sees him, Speedy Parker feels important. There is a light in the old man's eyes, a deep, knowing wisdom that seems as ancient as the ocean itself. Speedy stops his singing and smiles at Jack, a wide, genuine smile that crinkles the corners of his eyes. He seems to see right through Jack, right into the heart of his fear and his loneliness. He knows Jack's name. He knows about his mother. He speaks to Jack not as a child, but as an equal, as someone who is carrying a heavy burden. He offers Jack a drink from a silver flask. It is not alcohol, he assures him. It is something else. He calls it the magic juice. Jack, despite a lifetime of being told not to talk to strangers, feels an undeniable pull of trust toward this man. He takes a small sip. The liquid is sweet and fiery like liquid sunlight. And as it goes down, the world explodes. It is not a daydream this time. It is more. He is suddenly standing on a different beach, under a sky that is a deep, impossible violet. 2 moons hang in the air. The sand beneath his feet is a warm, golden color. The air is thick with the smell of alien blossoms and spices. In the distance, he sees a dark tower, a needle of black stone pointing toward the twin moons. He sees a beautiful, regal woman on a balcony. She looks like his mother, but healthier, stronger. She is a queen, and she is weeping. He sees a terrible, dark man with red eyes, a man who looks chillingly like Morgan Sloat. Then, just as quickly as it came, the vision is gone. Jack is back on the cold, grey beach of New Hampshire, the taste of the magic juice still on his tongue, his heart hammering in his chest. Speedy Parker looks at him, his expression gentle. He tells Jack that what he saw was real. He tells him about the territories. It is another world, a parallel dimension that exists alongside our own. Almost everyone in our world has a twinner in the territories, a kind of soulmate or mirror image. Jack's mother has a twinner, and she is the queen of that world, Laura Deloessian. And just as Lily Kavanaugh is dying of cancer, her twinner, the queen, is also dying of a mysterious ailment. Their fates are intertwined. If one dies, the other will surely follow. Speedy explains that the territories are a magical place, but they are also in terrible danger. The man Jack saw, the man who looks like Morgan Sloat, is his twinner. His name is Morgan of Orris, a cunning and evil sorcerer who is slowly poisoning the queen and the land itself. Morgan of Orris wants to usurp the throne and seize power. And Morgan Sloat, in our world, is his accomplice. They are working together across the dimensions to achieve their dark goals. The hunting accident that killed Jack's father was no accident. It was murder orchestrated by the two Morgans because Jack's father stood in their way. This is why Morgan Sloat keeps Jack and his mother close. He is waiting for Lily to die so that the queen will also perish, leaving the territories vulnerable. Jack listens, his mind reeling. It sounds like a fantasy story, like something out of one of the books he used to love, but the vision he had was too real. The feeling of truth in Speedy's words is too strong to deny. For the first time in a long time, a tiny, fragile spark of hope ignites within him. He asks Speedy if there is a way to save them, to save his mother and the queen. Speedy nods. There is a way. There is an object of immense power, an object that can heal any illness, cure any poison, and restore life to the dying land. It is called the Talisman. It lies at the other end of the American continent, in a black hotel by the Western Sea. But the journey to get it is long and perilous. The Talisman is in our world, but to get there, Jack will have to travel through the territories. He will have to learn to flip between the worlds, a dangerous and disorienting process. And all the while, Morgan of Orris and his creatures will be hunting him. It is a quest for a hero, a journey that would test the strongest of men, let alone a 12-year-old boy. Speedy looks at Jack, his gaze steady and serious. He tells Jack that he is the only one who can do it. Jack is special. He is the son of Phil Sawyer, who was from the territories himself, a fact kept secret from Jack his whole life. This is why Jack has the daydreams. It is the territories calling to him, a memory of his own heritage. This is why he can travel between the worlds. It is his birthright. The choice is laid before him, as stark and clear as the line between the sea and the sky. He can stay here in the cold comfort of the Alhambra and watch his mother fade away. Or he can embark on an impossible journey, facing unimaginable dangers with only the slimmest chance of success. For Jack, it is not really a choice at all. The thought of doing nothing is more terrifying than any monster the territories could possibly hold. He looks at Speedy Parker and says, yes, he will go. Speedy takes Jack to his small, cluttered shack on the edge of the fun world. The place smells of polish and old wood and something else, something faintly magical. He gives Jack his final instructions. He teaches him the trick of flipping, explaining that he needs to find a place where the worlds are thin, and he needs a specific object from the other world to do it. Speedy gives Jack an old guitar pick. It belonged to a musician who was a great man in the territories. This will be his key. He also gives Jack the rest of the magic juice, a powerful aid that will help him on his way, but he warns him to use it sparingly. Its power is great, but finite. Speedy's final warning is the most chilling. He tells Jack about the creatures Morgan will send after him, men with the heads of wolves, strange, twisted things that are half animal, half human. He warns him that the territories are beautiful, but they are not safe. Every step of the journey will be fraught with peril. He must trust his instincts, he must be brave, and he must never, ever give up. With the guitar pick in his pocket and Speedy's words echoing in his mind, Jack leaves the shack. The sun is beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air is cold on his skin. He is just a boy standing on a beach, about to step into a fairy tale. A dark fairy tale. He walks to the edge of the water, the place where the waves hiss and retreat. He holds the guitar pick tightly in his hand. He closes his eyes and concentrates, trying to feel the other world, the world of his daydreams, the world Speedy showed him. For a moment, nothing happens. He feels a surge of doubt, a cold wave of fear. What if it was all a trick? What if Speedy is just a crazy old man? What if he is just a scared little boy who wants to believe in magic because the real world is too cruel to bear? But then he thinks of his mother, her pale face, her labored breathing. He thinks of the Queen weeping on the balcony. He thinks of Morgan Sloat's cold, dead eyes. The doubt is burned away by a fire of desperation and love. He focuses all his will, all his hope, all his fear into a single point. And then it begins. The world does not so much change as it shimmers. It is like looking through a pane of glass with water running down it. The sound of the ocean deepens, changing its rhythm. The smell of salt and fish is replaced by something else entirely. Something rich and loamy, the smell of ancient forests and damp earth. He feels a strange, pulling sensation, a dizzying lurch as if the ground itself is shifting beneath his feet. He opens his eyes. He is no longer on the beach. He is standing in a field of tall, reddish grass under the violet sky with its two moons. The air is warm and humid, buzzing with the sound of unseen insects. In the distance, the dark tower he saw in his vision looms, a silent sentinel. The sheer, vibrant reality of it all is overwhelming. It is more real than the world he just left. Every color is brighter, every sound is sharper, every smell is more intense. This is the territories, and it is beautiful. But his awe is shattered by the sound of a horn, a harsh braying sound that cuts through the air. A short distance away, a road of packed earth winds through the field. On it, a grand, ornate carriage is approaching, pulled by 6 monstrous creatures that look like a cross between a horse and a lizard. The carriage is black, decorated with twisted silver carvings. Riding alongside it are armored guards, their faces hidden behind cruel-looking helmets. And sitting in the carriage, Jack can see him. The man with the red eyes, Morgan of Oris, panic, cold and absolute, seizes Jack. Speedy's warnings come crashing back to him. He is in Morgan's lands. He has appeared almost on his enemy's doorstep. He has to run. He has to hide. He turns and plunges into the tall, red grass, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The grass is thick and sharp, scratching at his face and hands. He can hear shouts from the road. The guards have seen him. He can hear the heavy thud of their boots as they begin to give chase. He runs, fueled by pure adrenaline. He does not know where he is going. He just knows he has to get away. He can hear them getting closer. He stumbles and falls, the breath knocked out of him. He scrambles to his feet and keeps running. This is it, he thinks. This is how the quest ends, just moments after it began, captured by the enemy in a strange and terrifying land. But then instinct takes over. Without even thinking, he reaches into his pocket, his fingers closing around the smooth, familiar shape of his wallet, his keys, the coins from his own world. He focuses on them, on their reality, on the world they belong to. He thinks of the cold New Hampshire beach, the sound of the gulls, the peeling paint of the Alhambra. He pulls. He throws all of his will into the act of returning. The world shimmers again, the dizzying, nauseating lurch returns. The warm, fragrant air is replaced by the cold, salty wind of home. The red grass vanishes, and he is lying on the damp, dark sand of Hampton Beach. The violet sky is gone, replaced by the familiar twilight of his own world. He is alone. The sounds of the hunt, the guards, the monstrous horses, they are all gone. He is safe. He lies there for a long time, shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He can still feel the scratches on his face from the alien grass. He can still smell the air of the territories in his nostrils. It was real, all of it. The magic, the danger, the quest. It is all terribly, wonderfully real. He has taken the first step. He has flipped into the territories and back again. He has survived his first encounter with the enemy. He gets to his feet, his legs unsteady. He looks out at the ocean, at the vast, darkening expanse of water. He knows now that his journey will not just be across the country. It will be a journey across worlds. He has a long road ahead of him, a road filled with monsters and magic, with sorrow and wonder. He is no longer just Jack Sawyer, the boy whose mother is sick. He is Jack Sawyer, the traveller, and he has a talisman to find. The quest has begun. Chapter 2: The Road of Trials and a Loyal Friend. Jack did not stay on the beach for long. The chill of the night air was seeping into his bones, but it was the chill of fear that went deeper. He had seen his enemy. He knew now with absolute certainty that this was not a game or a dream. Morgan of Orris was real, and he was hunting for him. This meant Morgan Sloat, his father's old partner, was also hunting for him in this world. The Alhambra Inn, once his prison, now felt like the most dangerous place on earth. He had to get away. He had to start moving west. His first thought was of his mother. He crept back into the silent hotel, his sneakers making no sound on the thick, faded carpets. He went to her suite and stood in the doorway, watching her sleep. Her breathing was shallow, a soft, fluttering sound in the quiet room. The moonlight coming through the window cast her face in a pale, ghostly light. He felt a wave of love for her so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He was doing this for her. He had to remember that. He could not say goodbye. It would break her heart and alert Morgan Sloat. He wrote a short, cryptic note, one she might understand, but that would mean nothing to anyone else. It just said, "Going to get the magic. Be back soon. I love you." He left it on her bedside table, took one last look at her sleeping form, and slipped out of the room. He gathered what little he had, a backpack with a change of clothes, the small amount of cash he had saved, and a map of the United States he took from the hotel lobby. Most importantly, he had the guitar pick from Speedy and the small silver flask of magic juice. These were his tools, his only real weapons. He walked out of the Alhambra and did not look back. He started walking west, following the dark, empty ribbon of the highway. He was on his own. For a few days he managed. He hitched rides with truckers, telling them a practiced story about running away to see his father in Ohio. People were often kind, They bought him meals at roadside diners and warned him about the dangers of being on the road alone. He was careful. He stayed in the light. He slept in bus stations or hidden away in patches of woods just off the highway. During the day, he felt a strange sense of freedom. He was in charge of his own destiny for the first time in his life. But at night, the fear returned. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every snapping twig sounded like one of Morgan's creatures. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting to see a twisted face or a pair of red eyes staring back at him. His luck ran out in a small town in Ohio. He was trying to buy a bus ticket further west when a police officer saw him. He was a kind man, but he was firm. A 12-year-old boy traveling alone with a wad of cash was a red flag. The officer took Jack to the station, sat him down, and asked him where his parents were. Jack tried to lie, but his story quickly fell apart under the gentle, persistent questioning. He finally gave them his name, and that was his mistake. Within an hour, the phone rang at the police station. It was Morgan Sloat. His voice was smooth and full of false concern. He told the police that Jack was a troubled boy, prone to running away, that his mother was terribly ill, and this was all just too much for him. He said he would be there as soon as he could to pick Jack up. Jack tried to tell the police that Sloat was a bad man, that he was in danger, but they just looked at him with pity. To them, he was just a confused, scared kid making up stories. They put him in a small, quiet room to wait. Jack knew he was trapped. The jaws of the snare had closed around him. Morgan Sloat arrived a few hours later. He smiled at the police, thanked them profusely, and put a heavy hand on Jack's shoulder. The touch was like ice. As soon as they were in Sloat's expensive car, the smile vanished. Sloat's face became a mask of cold fury. He didn't yell. He spoke in a low, dangerous voice that was much more terrifying. He told Jack that he had been a very foolish boy. He told him that his mother was distraught. He told him that he was not going back to New Hampshire. He was being sent to a place for boys like him, a place that would teach him discipline, a place that would fix him. The place was called the Sunlight Home for Boys. It was in Indiana, in the middle of flat, empty farmland that stretched for miles in every direction. From the outside, it didn't look so bad. It was a large, old brick building with several newer, cheaper-looking dormitories built around it. There was a big field for playing sports and a small chapel with a tall, thin steeple. But as they got closer, Jack could feel a sense of wrongness about the place. It was a feeling as tangible as the cold glass of the car window. The very air around the Sunlight Home felt heavy and sad. There was no joy here. The man who ran the home met them at the door. His name was Reverend Robert Gardner. He was a tall, thin man with slicked back, oily black hair and small, dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a black suit that was too tight for him, and his smile was a bloodless slash in his pale face. The smile never reached his eyes. When he shook Jack's hand, his skin was cold and clammy like a fish. He spoke in a smooth, pious voice, quoting the Bible and talking about the importance of hard work and redemption. He told Morgan Sloat not to worry, that they would take good care of Jack. They would cast out his demons. Jack knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had just been handed over to a monster. Life in the Sunlight Home was a living nightmare. It was a prison disguised as a school. The entire place was run on a system of fear and brutal, arbitrary punishment. Reverend Gardner was the absolute ruler, and his word was law. He had a small army of cruel, thuggish older boys who acted as his enforcers. They were called the proctors, and they delighted in their power over the younger, weaker boys. The days were a monotonous grind of misery. They were woken up before dawn, forced to eat a breakfast of thin, grey oatmeal. and then sent out to work in the fields no matter the weather. The work was back-breaking, pulling weeds or harvesting vegetables for hours on end under the hot sun. After work, there were classes where they were taught by tired, bitter men who seemed to hate the boys as much as they hated their jobs. In the evening, there was a mandatory chapel service where Reverend Gardner would stand at the pulpit and scream at them for an hour about sin and hellfire, his face turning red, veins bulging on his neck. The slightest infraction was punished severely. Talking back, not working fast enough, falling asleep in chapel, all of it could earn you a trip to the shed. The shed was a small, windowless building behind the main dormitory. Inside was a wooden post and a collection of leather straps. Gardner would administer the punishments himself, his eyes gleaming with a kind of holy ecstasy as he brought the strap down again and again. The other boys lived in a state of constant, simmering terror. They were a collection of lost souls, orphans, runaways, kids whose parents just didn't want them anymore. They had learned that the only way to survive was to become invisible, to keep your head down and never draw attention to yourself. Jack tried to do this. He worked hard. He kept his mouth shut. He endured the terrible food, the endless sermons, and the casual cruelty of the proctors. But he could not become invisible. Gardner seemed to have a special interest in him. The Reverend knew he came from a wealthy background. He resented Jack for it. He seemed to take a special pleasure in trying to break him. He would single Jack out during his sermons, using him as an example of a pampered, sinful boy who had been led astray by the evils of the modern world. He would assign Jack the hardest, filthiest jobs. He was goading him, testing him, waiting for him to snap. Jack's only escape was in his mind. At night, lying on his thin, lumpy mattress in the crowded, smelly dormitory, he would think about his quest. He would think about his mother and the Queen and the Talisman. He would hold the guitar pick in his hand under the rough blanket and try to feel the pull of the territories. But he could not flip. The Sunlight home was a place of such misery and despair that it felt like the walls between the worlds were a mile thick. The magic was thin here. His daydreams had stopped completely. Hope began to feel like a distant memory. He felt the darkness of the place seeping into him, and he began to fear that he would be trapped here forever, that he would forget all about the territories and become one of the hollow-eyed, broken boys around him. It was in this pit of despair that he met Wolf. Jack had been at the Sunlight home for about a month. He was working in the fields, his hands raw and blistered, when one of the proctors, a big, mean boy named Heck, decided to have some fun. He knocked Jack's shovel out of his hands and pushed him to the ground. Heck and his friends stood over Jack, laughing, getting ready to kick him. Jack braced himself for the pain, but it never came. A large shadow fell over them. A very tall, broad-shouldered boy was standing there. He had to be 16 or 17, much older than most of the other boys. He had shaggy, dark hair and wore a pair of faded overalls. He was looking down at Heck with a confused, almost curious expression. "That's a bad smell," the boy said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "You smell bad, Heck." Heck, who was used to terrorizing everyone, was taken aback. "What did you say to me, you freak?" The tall boy just repeated himself, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "You smell bad, like something that's gone rotten. Jack doesn't smell bad. Leave him alone." Heck, furious at being challenged, took a swing at the tall boy. The boy caught Heck's fist in his own, much larger hand. He didn't seem to put any effort into it at all. He just held it. Heck struggled, his face turning red, but he couldn't get his hand free. The tall boy's grip was like iron. "Bad," the boy said again, and then he pushed Heck away. Heck stumbled and fell. He and his friends, suddenly looking much less brave, scrambled to their feet and hurried away, muttering threats. The tall boy turned to Jack and offered him a hand. Jack took it, and the boy pulled him to his feet effortlessly. "You're Jack," the boy said. It wasn't a question. "My name is Wolf." From that day on, Wolf became Jack's protector and his only friend. Wolf was different from anyone Jack had ever met. He was simple, almost childlike in his view of the world. Everything was either good or bad. People had good smells or bad smells. He spoke in short, declarative sentences. His favorite phrase was "right here and now." He didn't seem to understand complex ideas or things that happened in the past or future. He lived entirely in the present moment. He was incredibly strong, but he was never cruel. He was the gentlest person Jack had ever known. He was also, Jack quickly realized, not entirely from this world. Wolf would sometimes talk about his herd. He would talk about his brothers, his sister, his mother and father. He would describe running through vast forests under 2 moons. He would talk about the sweet taste of sheep's blood. At first, Jack thought Wolf was just making things up, a fantasy to escape the grim reality of the sunlight home. But then Jack began to notice other things. Wolf's eyes would sometimes flash with a yellow, animal-like light. He had an incredible sense of smell. He could tell you who was coming long before you could see or hear them, and he was terrified of the moon. On nights when the moon was full, Wolf would become agitated and sick. He would lock himself in a small closet and refuse to come out, making low, whining sounds like a frightened animal. Jack started to put the pieces together. The 2 moons, the herd, the animal senses. He remembered Speedy Parker's warning about the creatures Morgan of Orris would send after him, men with the heads of wolves. Jack realized that Wolf was one of them. He was a werewolf from the territories. But he was not a monster. He was kind and good. He had somehow gotten trapped in this world, in this horrible place. And he was just as lost and alone as Jack was. Their friendship deepened. They worked together in the fields. They sat together during the awful meals. At night, they would whisper to each other in the dark dormitory. Jack told Wolf about his quest, about the Talisman and the territories and his dying mother. Wolf seemed to understand. He didn't question the magic. It was as real to him as the ground beneath his feet. He just nodded and said, "We have to help your ma, right here and now." His loyalty was absolute. Jack was part of his herd now, and Wolf would do anything to protect him. Their friendship did not go unnoticed by Reverend Gardner. The Reverend hated to see any hint of happiness or companionship among his boys. He saw the bond between Jack and Wolf, and he decided to break it. He started punishing them for everything. He would separate them, assigning them to different work details. He would publicly humiliate Wolf, making fun of his simple way of speaking. He was trying to turn Jack against Wolf, to make Jack see him as a liability, a freak. But it had the opposite effect. It only made Jack more protective of his friend. It solidified their alliance against the common enemy. The breaking point came on a hot, humid afternoon in late October. Jack and Wolf were working in the potato fields. It was grueling work, digging in the hard, dry earth. Gardner was watching them, his dark eyes narrowed. He was looking for an excuse. He found one when Wolf, clumsy and tired, accidentally broke the head off his hoe. Gardner strode over, his face a mask of righteous anger. He began to scream at Wolf, calling him a stupid, useless animal. He grabbed Wolf by the collar and began to shake him. Jack couldn't stand it. He ran over and shouted at Gardner to leave him alone. For a moment, Gardner was stunned that anyone would dare to defy him. Then his face twisted into a terrible, ugly smile. This was exactly what he wanted. "You have a demon of defiance in you, Jack Sawyer. Gardner hissed. "And you are just a dumb beast. Tonight, we will beat the sin out of both of you. You will both be guests of honor in the shed." A trip to the shed was bad enough for one person, but a double feature, as Gardner liked to call it, was something else. It meant a beating so severe that boys often couldn't walk for days afterward. Jack felt a cold dread wash over him, but Wolf just looked at Gardner, his eyes wide with a strange, calm clarity. "The moon is full tonight," Wolf said softly. "Bad moon. You'll have a bad smell tonight, Gardner. A very bad smell." Gardner just laughed, a high, ugly sound, and walked away. That evening, the atmosphere in the dormitory was thick with tension. The other boys avoided Jack and Wolf, their eyes full of a mixture of pity and fear. As the sun went down, Wolf began to get agitated. He paced back and forth, his big hands clenching and unclenching. He kept looking out the window at the sky, where a perfect white circle of a moon was beginning to rise. "It's coming, Jack," he whimpered. "The change! Wolf, it's coming!" Jack tried to calm him down, but it was no use. Wolf's breathing became harsh and ragged. A low growl started deep in his chest. Just then the dormitory door creaked open. Two of the largest proctors stood there. "Gardner wants you," one of them grunted. "Both of you, now!" They walked across the dark yard toward the shed. The full moon bathed everything in a stark, silver light. Wolf was shaking, his whole body trembling. As they reached the door of the shed, Gardner stepped out of the shadows. He was holding a thick leather strap in his hands, slapping it against his palm. "Welcome, sinners," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "It's time for your sermon." He shoved Jack inside the shed. It was dark and smelled of sweat and fear. The wooden post stood in the center of the small room. But before Gardner could push Wolf inside, it began. Wolf let out a terrible cry, a sound that was half human and half animal. He fell to his knees, his body convulsing. Jack watched in horror and awe from the doorway. He could hear the sound of bones popping and shifting, a sickening, wet, cracking sound. Wolf's clothes began to tear as his body changed, his shoulders broadening, his spine elongating. Coarse, dark fur sprouted from his skin, his face pushed forward into a long, wolf-like snout, his teeth lengthening into sharp fangs, his gentle, confused eyes turned a burning, furious yellow. In a matter of seconds, the boy named Wolf was gone. In his place stood a massive, terrifying creature, a werewolf from the darkest corners of a fairy tale. The proctors and Gardner were frozen in shock, their faces pale with disbelief and terror. The creature that was Wolf rose to its full height, towering over them. It let out a deafening roar that shook the very walls of the shed. Then it lunged. What followed was a blur of violence and righteous fury. The creature moved with incredible speed and strength. It tossed the proctors aside like rag dolls. It was not killing them, but it was hurting them, breaking bones, punishing them for every act of cruelty they had ever committed. Gardner, his face a mask of pure terror, tried to run. The werewolf was on him in a flash, knocking him to the ground. It stood over him, its massive claws extended, hot saliva dripping from its fangs onto the Reverend's face. Gardner screamed, a high, thin shriek of absolute terror. Jack ran out of the shed. "Wolf!" he shouted. "No, don't kill him, we have to go, right here and now!" The werewolf turned its head and looked at Jack. For a terrifying second, Jack saw only a wild, savage beast. But then he saw a flicker of recognition in the yellow eyes. It was his friend. Wolf was still in there. The creature let out one last terrifying roar at the whimpering man on the ground, then turned and bounded over to Jack's side. Chaos had erupted across the grounds of the Sunlight home. Lights were coming on in the dormitories. Boys were shouting. Jack knew they only had a few minutes before the entire staff was awake and hunting for them. "Come on," he yelled, and started to run. The giant werewolf ran beside him, easily keeping pace. They ran toward the fields, toward the fence that marked the edge of their prison. The fence was tall, topped with barbed wire. For Jack, it was an impossible obstacle. For Wolf, it was nothing. He leaped over it in a single powerful bound. He turned and looked back at Jack. Jack knew he could never make it over, but then he remembered the territories. He found a spot where the moonlight cast a deep shadow from a large tree. It felt right. It felt thin. He pulled the guitar pick from his pocket. He closed his eyes and concentrated, pulling with all his might. The world shimmered. The smell of cut grass and damp earth was replaced by the rich, loamy scent of a massive forest. He opened his eyes. He was in the territories. The trees here were enormous, far larger than any he had ever seen, their tops lost in the violet twilight of the twin moons. And standing beside him, looking just as solid and real as he did, was the werewolf. Wolf had flipped with him. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Jack was free. They ran deep into the woods of the territories, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the place of their torment. As the night wore on, the moon began to set. Jack watched as his friend went through the transformation again, this time in reverse. The fur receded, the snout shortened, the bones shifted back into their human configuration. Soon, the exhausted, naked, and completely human wolf was lying on the forest floor, fast asleep. Jack covered him with his own jacket and sat beside him, watching over him until the suns of the territories began to rise. Their journey truly began now. They traveled through the territories for a time, a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. They saw incredible things, herds of strange, gentle beasts, flocks of birds with rainbow-colored feathers, and trees that seemed to sing in the wind. But they also saw signs of Morgan of Orris's blight, patches of forest that were dead and grey, rivers that were choked with a black sludge, and villages that were empty and silent, their inhabitants having fled or been killed. They were constantly hunted. They were attacked by strange, bird-like creatures with sharp talons and by twisted goblin-like men who served Morgan. Wolf, even in his human form, was a fierce fighter, and Jack was learning to be quick and clever. They learned to survive together. They could not stay in the territories forever. They needed to make progress in the real world, to head west. They learned to flip back and forth. They would travel for a few days in the territories, covering vast distances much more quickly than they could in their own world, and then flip back to America. They would appear in a field in Illinois or a forest in Missouri. They were fugitives with no money and no one to help them but each other. They learned to live on the edges of society. They stole food from farms when they had to. They slept in barns and abandoned buildings. Their primary mode of transportation became the freight trains that crisscrossed the country. Hopping a train was dangerous, but it was fast, and it was free. They would wait in the darkness of a rail yard, listening for the slow rumble of an approaching train, the screech of its brakes. They would run alongside it, looking for an open boxcar, and then Wolf, with his incredible strength, would haul Jack up and then pull himself in after. The inside of a boxcar became their moving home. They would huddle together in the corner for warmth as the train rattled and swayed its way across the plains. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks became the soundtrack to their journey. Through the open door, they watched America scroll by like a long, slow movie. They saw vast fields of corn stretching to the horizon, small towns with their blinking traffic lights, and distant cities that glowed on the horizon like clusters of fallen stars. They were two lonely boys running from a dark past and toward an uncertain future. but they had each other. In those quiet moments in the rumbling boxcar, their bond became unbreakable. Jack would tell Wolf stories about his life before all this, about his mother's movies, about living in California. Wolf would listen, his head cocked to one side, a look of simple wonder on his face. And Wolf would tell Jack more about the territories, about his herd, about the way the world was supposed to be, a world of loyalty and simple truths. Jack realized that Wolf was the most decent person he had ever met. He was pure, uncorrupted by the cynicism and cruelty of the world. He was his brother. One evening, as they were rattling through Nebraska, Jack looked at his friend. Wolf was staring out the open door at the sunset, which was painting the enormous sky in brilliant streaks of orange and red. He looked peaceful. "We're going to make it, Wolf," Jack said. Wolf turned and gave him a wide, simple smile. "Wolf," he said, which was his way of agreeing, "right here and now, we'll get the magic for your ma." Jack smiled back. He was tired. He was hungry. He was scared. But for the first time, he truly believed they could do it. They were a herd of two, and they were heading west toward the setting sun, toward the Black Hotel, and toward the Talisman. Chapter 3. The Price of Magic and the Talisman's Light. The journey on the rails carried them deep into the heart of America. Jack and Wolf rode in the rumbling darkness of boxcars, watching the country change through the open door. The flat, endless fields of the Midwest gave way to the rolling hills and wide open skies of the Great Plains. The days were a hypnotic rhythm of clattering wheels and swaying motion. The nights were cold, filled with the lonely sound of the train's whistle cutting through the immense darkness. They were a team, a herd of two, surviving on their wits and their loyalty to one another. But the journey was taking its toll. They were always hungry. Food was a constant, gnawing concern. Sometimes they got lucky, finding an orchard with ripe fruit or a field of vegetables near the tracks. Other times, they had to steal. Jack hated it. He hated the feeling of creeping onto someone's property in the dead of night, his heart pounding with fear and shame, to grab a few loaves of bread from a cooling rack or some milk from a farmer's porch. Wolf didn't understand shame. To him it was simple. The herd was hungry. The herd needed to eat. He would move with a silent animal grace, his senses on high alert, and always managed to get them something. Jack knew they wouldn't have survived this long without him. The constant threat of being discovered was a heavy weight. Every time the train slowed for a town, they would hide in the deepest shadows of the boxcar, praying that no railway workers or police would check it. Morgan Sloat was still out there. Jack knew the man would have put out alerts that his name and picture were probably in every police station in the country. They were ghosts, slipping through the cracks of the world, and they could not afford to be seen. The territories offered a respite, but also its own dangers. They would flip into the other world when the landscape felt right, when the need to cover a great distance was urgent. The forests of the territories were vast and ancient, but they were also full of Morgan of Orris's spies. They were stalked by large, crow-like birds with intelligent, malevolent eyes that would circle high overhead, watching their every move. Twice they were ambushed by patrols of Orris's guards, hulking men with the faces of snarling dogs, and had to fight their way free, escaping back into their own world with their hearts hammering in their chests. Wolf fought with a savage fury on these occasions, a protective instinct so powerful it was terrifying to behold. Jack was learning to fight too, using his speed and his wits to outsmart their enemies. But each fight left them more exhausted, more battered. The magic juice that Speedy Parker had given him was almost gone. Jack had used it sparingly, only taking a sip when he was injured. or when the despair became too much to bear. Each time, the fiery liquid would flood him with strength and hope, clearing his mind and healing his wounds. But now, only a few precious drops remained at the bottom of the silver flask. He was saving it for the end, for the final confrontation. When it was gone, they would be well and truly on their own. As they traveled through Colorado, the landscape began to change again. The flat plains rose up to meet the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The air grew colder, thinner. Jack consulted his map. He knew where he needed to go. Before he and his mother had fled to New Hampshire, they had lived in California, and Jack's best friend in the world, Richard Sloat, was now a student at a prestigious boarding school in Illinois. Richard was the smartest person Jack knew. He was logical, sensible, and solid. In a world that had turned into a chaotic, terrifying nightmare, Richard represented everything that was normal and safe. Jack had avoided contacting him, not wanting to put him in danger. But now he felt a desperate need for his friend. He was tired of being alone with only the simple, loyal wolf for company. He needed someone who knew him, someone who could help him think, someone who could maybe, just maybe, help him make sense of all this. He knew it was a huge risk. Richard was Morgan Sloat's son, but Jack knew Richard. He was nothing like his father. He was kind and he was trustworthy. Jack decided he had to take the chance. They got off the train in a small town in eastern Illinois, and, by a combination of hitchhiking and walking, they made their way to the Thayer School. The Thayer School was another world entirely. It was a collection of stately brick buildings with white columns and perfectly manicured lawns. Boys in crisp, identical uniforms walked along the stone pathways, their book bags slung over their shoulders. The air of quiet, studious privilege was so thick you could almost taste it. After weeks of living on the road, of sleeping in filth and fighting for their lives, Jack and Wolf felt like creatures from another planet. They were dirty, their clothes were ragged, and they smelled of wood smoke and sweat. They hid in a small patch of woods at the edge of the campus, watching the students go by, and waited for nightfall. Jack had sent a cryptic postcard to Richard a week earlier, telling him to meet him at the old boathouse on the campus lake at midnight on a specific date. He had signed it with a nickname only Richard would know. It was a long shot, but it was the only way. As midnight approached, Jack and Wolf crept across the dark, silent campus. The boathouse was a small, dilapidated building at the edge of a still, black lake. They slipped inside and waited, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the pilings. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. A thin beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness. "Jack," a voice whispered, "are you in here? This isn't funny." "I'm here, Richard," Jack said, his voice hoarse. The flashlight beam found him. Richard Sloat stood in the doorway, looking exactly the same as Jack remembered him, only a little taller. He had the same sandy hair, the same scattering of freckles across his nose, the same intelligent, worried eyes behind a pair of thick glasses. He was wearing his Thayer School pajamas and a bathrobe. He stared at Jack, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. "Jack? My God, what happened to you? You look like you've been sleeping in a ditch." "Something like that," Jack said. He stepped forward, and the two friends hugged, a quick, awkward embrace. It felt good to see him, a solid anchor in Jack's swirling world. Richard's light then fell on the large figure standing silently in the corner. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice suddenly wary. "This is my friend Wolf," Jack said. Wolf stepped into the light and gave Richard a wide, simple smile. "Hello, Richard," he said. "You smell good, like books." Richard just stared, his eyes wide. He looked from the huge, strange boy in overalls back to Jack's ragged appearance. "Jack, what is going on? My father said you had some kind of breakdown. He said you ran away. Everyone's been looking for you." And so Jack began to explain. He sat there in the dark, musty boathouse and told Richard everything. He told him about his mother's sickness, about Speedy Parker, about the territories and the Queen. He told him about Morgan of Orris and his own father's role in the evil plan. He told him about the talisman and his quest to find it. He talked for over an hour, the words pouring out of him in a desperate, frantic rush. Richard listened patiently, his expression shifting from concern to deep, profound worry. When Jack was finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the sound of the water. "Jack," Richard said finally, his voice gentle, like he was talking to someone who was very sick. "I think you need help. I think the stress of your mom's illness, it's made you invent this whole story. There are no other worlds, there's no magic. It's a delusion." "It's not a delusion, Richard. It's real," Jack insisted, his frustration mounting. "Wolf is from there. Tell him, Wolf." Wolf just nodded. "The territories are real," he said, as if stating the sky was blue. "Right here and now." Richard just shook his head sadly. "Jack, he seems very simple. You can't use him as proof. You need to see a doctor. My father can get you the best doctors." "Your father is the enemy!" Jack shouted, his voice echoing in the small space. "He's trying to kill me. He's the one who put me in that horrible sunlight home." He told Richard about Gardner and the beatings about their escape. Richard's face was pale. "I knew he sent you to a school, but I didn't know it was like that." "My dad, he can be a hard man, but he's not a monster, Jack. He's not evil." Richard truly believed it. He loved his father. He couldn't see the darkness that lay behind the man's smooth, successful facade. Jack knew that words were not enough. He had to show him. It was the only way. "I'm going to prove it to you," Jack said, his voice low and determined. "But you have to promise me something. You have to promise you won't tell anyone we were here, especially not your father." Richard hesitated, then nodded. He was scared for his friend, and he agreed, hoping he could talk some sense into him. They agreed to meet in the same place the next night. Jack and Wolf slipped away, leaving Richard alone in the dark, his mind reeling with confusion and fear. The next night, they met again. Jack had brought the flask with the last few drops of the magic juice. He knew this was a terrible risk. He might need it later, but he needed Richard. He needed his help, and he needed his belief. "You have to drink this," Jack said, holding out the flask. Richard recoiled. "What is it? Is it drugs? Jack, have you been taking drugs?" "It's not drugs, it's a key. It will help you see, just a little bit. Please, Richard, trust me." Richard looked into Jack's desperate eyes. He saw not madness, but a deep, pleading sincerity. Against his better judgment, he took the flask and drank the last few drops. For a moment, nothing happened. "See?" Richard said a little shakily. "It's nothing, just some kind of weird soda." And then his eyes widened. The air in the boathouse began to shimmer. The familiar wooden walls seemed to grow thin, transparent. Through them, he could see a strange, violet sky. The smell of the lake was replaced by the smell of a huge, alien forest. He could hear strange music, faint and beautiful. He clapped his hands over his ears and squeezed his eyes shut. "What's happening?" he whimpered. "I'm hallucinating." "You're not hallucinating," Jack said softly. "You're seeing. You're seeing the other world." He took Richard's arm. Now comes the hard part. He pulled Richard outside into a small clearing in the woods at the edge of the campus. Wolf stood guard, watching the shadows. "I have to take you there," Jack said. "It's the only way you'll believe me. It might hurt. It might make you sick, but you have to see." "No, Jack, please," Richard begged, his voice trembling. He was terrified. His logical, orderly world was cracking apart at the seams, but Jack was determined. He held onto Richard's arm, pulled out the guitar pick, and focused. He pulled. The world dissolved. For Richard, it was not a smooth transition. It was a violent, wrenching tear in the fabric of reality. He felt a nauseating lurch, a feeling of being turned inside out. One moment he was standing in the familiar woods of his school, the next he was somewhere else entirely. The shock was absolute. He was standing in a forest of impossibly large trees, their trunks as wide as small houses. The ground was covered in a soft, springy moss that glowed with a faint, internal light. The air was warm and smelled of cinnamon and damp earth. And in the violet sky above, 2 moons hung like pale, luminous eyes. Richard fell to his knees, gasping for air. He was sick, his head spinning. The world was too big, too bright, too strange. Every law of physics he had ever learned was being broken right in front of him. It was too much for his rational mind to process. Wolf knelt beside him, putting a large, comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," Wolf said. "The territories are okay, just breathe." "It's real," Richard whispered, his voice full of a terrible awe. "It's all real." He looked at Jack, his eyes wide with a new kind of understanding and a new kind of fear. "Your mother, the Queen, my father." "Yes," Jack said grimly. "All of it." Their time in the territories was short. Richard was too sick to stay for long. His body, not born of the magic like Jack's, was rejecting the world. His nose began to bleed, and he grew weak and dizzy. Jack knew he had to get him back. They flipped back into their own world, reappearing in the woods behind the school. Richard collapsed on the ground, shivering and pale. The proof had been given, but it had come at a terrible price. Richard was no longer a skeptic. He was a believer, and he was terrified, but he was also Jack's friend. He knew he couldn't let Jack and Wolf continue on their own. He made a decision. He would go with them. He packed a bag with food, a first aid kit, and all the money he had in his savings account. He left a note for the school authorities saying he was taking a personal leave of absence, and then, under the cover of darkness, the 3 of them left the Thayer school behind. Richard Sloat, the logical, studious boy, had joined the impossible quest. The journey west became even harder. Richard was a constant source of worry. The brief trip to the territories had done something to him. He was sick. He had terrible headaches and frequent gushing nosebleeds. He was paranoid and jumpy, startled by every shadow. The rough life of a fugitive was completely alien to him. He complained about the food, the cold, the dirt. He and Wolf, despite a grudging respect, did not get along. Richard, with his complex thoughts and fears, could not understand Wolf's simple, direct view of the world. And Wolf, who sensed everything as good or bad smells, was disturbed by the constant scent of fear and sickness that clung to Richard. They became a strange, fractured family, bound together by Jack. Jack was the leader now, the one who had to make the decisions, the one who had to keep the peace. He had to care for Richard, who was physically and mentally falling apart, and he had to reassure Wolf, who was confused by Richard's erratic behavior. The burden on Jack's 12-year-old shoulders was immense. They crossed the rest of the country, a long, miserable blur of train yards and desolate landscapes. Richard's condition grew worse. Jack knew that time was running out. His mother was dying, and every day they spent on the road was a day she grew weaker. He pushed them onward, driven by a desperate urgency. Finally, they reached California. They made their way to the coast, to a small, forgotten tourist town called Point Venuti. The town itself was dreary and sad. a collection of run-down motels and closed-up souvenir shops. The sky was perpetually grey, and a cold, damp mist seemed to hang over everything. And there, at the very edge of the continent, perched on a cliff overlooking the churning grey Pacific, was their destination, the Agincourt Hotel. It was a vast, sprawling structure built of dark wood that had been weathered to a deep, ominous black. It was all sharp angles and forbidding towers, looking less like a hotel and more like a fortress. It loomed against the grey sky like a monument to despair. A palpable aura of evil radiated from it, a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. This was the place. The Talisman was somewhere inside, and so was their enemy. They found a place to hide in the overgrown, thorny bushes on a hill overlooking the hotel. They watched it for a full day, trying to form a plan. The place was not abandoned. Strange, hulking men in dark uniforms patrolled the grounds. Jack recognized them. They were like the guards he had seen in the territories. Morgan Sloat was here, and he had brought his otherworldly army with him. Richard was in a terrible state. He was weak, feverish, and barely coherent. The proximity to the hotel, a place where the walls between the worlds were thin and twisted, was making him sicker. He begged Jack to leave, to give up. "We can't win, Jack," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "Look at that place, it's death." But Jack couldn't give up. He was too close. He looked at his two friends, Wolf, loyal and steady as a rock, ready to follow him into hell itself. And Richard, sick and terrified, but who had still come all this way for him. He knew he had to go in alone. He told Wolf to stay and protect Richard. If he wasn't back by sunrise, they were to run. "No," Wolf said, his voice a low growl. "The herd stays together. Wolf goes with you, Jack, right here and now." Jack knew he couldn't argue. In the dead of night, under a sky with no moon and no stars, Jack and Wolf made their way down to the Black Hotel. They found a way in through a service entrance and entered the belly of the beast. The inside of the hotel was a nightmare maze of long dark corridors and dusty, silent rooms. The air was cold and dead, and the silence was heavy, oppressive. They moved like shadows, their senses on high alert. They were not alone for long. The hotel was full of traps and guardians. They were attacked by animated suits of armor that swung rusty swords, and by monstrous dog-like creatures that burst out of darkened rooms. Wolf fought with a desperate, savage courage, tearing their enemies apart with his bare hands. He was protecting Jack, clearing a path for him, taking the brunt of the attacks. He was wounded, his body covered in deep cuts, but he would not stop. Finally, they reached the heart of the hotel, a vast, circular ballroom. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Morgan Sloat. He was not alone. Standing beside him was a shimmering, distorted figure, a man who looked like him, but was taller, crueler, his eyes glowing with a faint red light. Morgan of Oris. The two Morgans stood together, a terrifying fusion of two worlds' evil. And between them, on a black pedestal, was the Talisman. It was not what Jack expected. It was a crystal sphere about the size of a basketball, but it was alive. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, a light that was the color of pure joy. It sang a silent song, a music that Jack could feel in his bones, a song of creation and healing and love. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "So the little traveller has arrived," Morgan Sloat said, his voice smooth and cold. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, Jack. But it ends now. The Talisman is mine." The final battle began. The two Morgans unleashed their power. The air crackled with dark energy. The walls of the ballroom seemed to twist and writhe. Jack dodged blasts of crackling black lightning. Wolf charged, a roar of pure fury erupting from his throat. He threw himself at the two Morgans, a loyal protector fighting for his herd. He managed to knock Morgan Sloat to the ground, but Morgan of Orris was a sorcerer of immense power. He raised a hand, and a bolt of pure, corrosive darkness struck Wolf in the chest. Wolf cried out, a sound of shock and pain. He stumbled backward, a smoking black hole in his overalls. He looked at Jack, his eyes full of a sad, simple surprise. "Jack," he whispered, "I'm sorry." And then he fell, his big body hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He was gone. A cry of rage and grief tore itself from Jack's throat. His friend, his brother, was dead. The loss was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, he was paralyzed by sorrow. But then he saw the talisman. He saw his mother's pale face. He saw Wolf's trusting smile. He knew he could not give up. He ran. He ignored the Morgans, ignored the pain in his heart, and ran for the pedestal. He leaped, his hands reaching for the singing globe of light. He wrapped his arms around it. The moment his skin touched its surface, the world exploded in pure, white light. The power that surged through him was immense, overwhelming. It was the power of life itself. He could feel the entire world, both of them, all at once. He could feel every living thing, every tree, every animal, every person. And he could feel the darkness of the two Morgans, a sour, rotten note in the universal symphony. He turned, holding the glowing talisman in front of him like a shield. The light that poured from it was blinding. The two Morgans shrieked as the pure, healing energy washed over them. Their evil could not exist in its presence. Morgan of Orris's shimmering form dissolved like smoke in the wind. Morgan Sloat, his face contorted in a mask of agony, was thrown backward, crashing against the far wall of the ballroom. He was not dead, but he was broken, his power shattered. Jack stood alone in the silent ballroom, holding the talisman, the body of his friend lying on the floor. He was a 12-year-old boy who had crossed a continent and two worlds. He had faced the ultimate evil and won, but the victory felt hollow. He had the talisman. He could save his mother, but he had lost his best friend. He walked over to Wolf's body, tears streaming down his face. He gently touched the talisman to his friend's chest. For a moment, he hoped for a miracle that the talisman's power could bring him back. But some things, even magic, cannot fix. Wolf was gone. Jack wept over his friend, his grief a raw, open wound. He knew he could not stay. He had to get back. He had to get the talisman to his mother. He picked it up. It was not heavy. It felt warm and alive in his arms. He walked out of the black hotel, leaving the broken form of Morgan Sloat in the darkness. He found Richard huddled in the bushes, sick and terrified. When Richard saw the glowing sphere in Jack's arms, his eyes filled with awe. The journey back east was not a flight. It was a pilgrimage. Jack walked, carrying the talisman. He could have flipped, could have taken a train, but he chose to walk. And as he walked, a miracle occurred. The talisman's light shone out, and the world began to heal around him. He walked through blighted fields in the territories, and behind him, green shoots pushed up through the dead soil. He walked past poisoned rivers, and the water began to run clear. The blight of Morgan of Orris was being erased by the talisman's pure song. He flipped back to his own world. The healing continued. He walked through poor, broken towns, and the people who saw him felt a sudden, unexplainable surge of hope. Sick people who were near him felt their pain ease. The talisman was not just for his mother or the Queen. It was for everyone. It was a force for good in a world that had so much darkness. It was a long, slow journey across the country he had just raced through. He was no longer a scared boy running for his life. He was a guardian, a healer, carrying a piece of heaven in his arms. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached New Hampshire. He reached the Alhambra Inn. The hotel was even quieter and sadder than when he had left. Morgan Sloat, though defeated, had made it back before him, a broken man waiting for the end. He was in the lobby, but he was no threat now. The Talisman's presence rendered him powerless. Jack walked past him without a word and went up to his mother's suite. She was barely alive. She was a skeleton, her breath a faint whisper. The room smelled of sickness and death. Jack walked to her bedside and knelt down. He gently placed the talisman on her chest. The light filled the room, a warm golden radiance that chased out every shadow. It sank into his mother's body. He watched, his heart in his throat, as the color returned to her cheeks. He saw the deep, painful lines of her illness smooth away. Her breathing grew stronger, deeper. The cancer, the darkness that had been consuming her, was being burned away by the pure, holy light. Her eyes fluttered open. For the first time in months, they were clear. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "Jack," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "My boy, you came back." "I told you I'd get the magic," he said, the tears finally coming. Tears not of grief, but of relief and love. He had done it. He had saved her. He had fulfilled his quest. He had won. He lay his head on her bed, exhausted beyond measure, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt a sense of peace. The journey was over. But he knew as he drifted off to sleep that he would carry the scars and the memory of the friend he had lost forever. Chapter 4. The Sleeping Hero and the Waking Nightmare. 20 years is a long time. It is long enough for a boy to become a man. It is long enough for the most vivid and terrifying memories to fade, to soften around the edges until they feel less like lived experience and more like scenes from a half-forgotten dream. For Jack Sawyer, 20 years had been a deliberate and concerted effort to forget. He had taken the magic, the wonder, and the horror of his 12th year and locked it away in a deep, dark box in the furthest corner of his mind. He had turned the key, walked away, and dedicated his life to the mundane, the logical, the explainable. He had chosen to live in only one world. After his mother, Lily Cavanaugh, had been healed by the talisman, their lives had changed. The object itself had faded, its purpose served, its light retreating from the world. Morgan Sloat, broken and powerless, had eventually died, a pathetic and lonely end for a man who had trafficked in cosmic evil. With Sloat's influence gone, they discovered that Lily's finances were not as dire as he had made them seem. They were comfortable. They moved back to California, and Jack tried to be a normal kid. He went to high school. He went to college. He did his best to convince himself that the journey across America, the flips into the territories, the loyal friendship of a werewolf boy named Wolf, and the final terrible confrontation in a black hotel were all just a complicated, stress-induced hallucination. A story a sick boy had told himself to cope with his mother's impending death. He was mostly successful. The daydream stopped. He never felt the shimmer of the other world. He never smelled the air of the territories on the breeze. He became a man of facts and evidence. It was no surprise then that he became a cop. He joined the Los Angeles Police Department and quickly distinguished himself. He had an uncanny knack for homicide cases. He could walk into a room where a terrible crime had occurred and see things other detectives missed. He could piece together a narrative from the silent, brutal language of the evidence. He had an intuition, a gut feeling that was almost never wrong. His colleagues called it the Sawyer Glimmer. They thought he was a genius, a natural-born detective. Jack just thought he was good at his job. He never allowed himself to consider that his talent came from a part of him he refused to acknowledge, a part of him that was used to seeing the patterns that lay hidden beneath the surface of the world. He rose through the ranks, becoming a lieutenant in the homicide division. He was respected, admired, and a little feared. He was a closer. He solved the cases no one else could. He put away dozens of killers, looking into the faces of the worst kind of human darkness and never flinching. He dealt in a world of motives that were ugly and simple: greed, jealousy, rage. It was a world that made sense, a world that had rules, but then a case came along that didn't. It was called the Munger case, a series of brutal, seemingly random killings. The killer left no evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA. He seemed to move like a ghost, but it was the feeling of the crime scenes that got to Jack. There was a sense of wrongness about them, a scent in the air that was not of this world. He started having headaches. The old daydreams threatened to return at the edges of his vision, shimmering distortions in the air. He pushed them down, attributing them to stress and lack of sleep. He solved the case, finally catching the killer, a quiet little man who worked in a bookstore. The man confessed, but he claimed that a voice had told him to do it, a voice that came from the squeaking of his pet hamster's wheel. It was a madman's excuse, but for a reason he couldn't explain, it chilled Jack to the bone. After the case was closed, Jack Sawyer, at the peak of his career, retired. He quit. He told everyone it was time for a change, that the job had taken too much from him. The truth was, the Munger case had scared him. It had come too close to rattling the lock on the box where he kept his childhood. It had reminded him that there were things in the world that did not fit into the neat categories of a police report. He had looked into a darkness that was not human, and it had looked back at him. So he ran. He bought a small, isolated house in the quiet hills outside the city and settled into a life of peaceful obscurity. He read books. He worked in his garden. He did his best to be no one, to be just another retired cop, living out his days. He was almost happy. The past, however, is never truly gone. It is just waiting for the right moment to come back. For Jack, that moment arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning in the form of a telephone call. The voice on the other end was strained, exhausted, and full of a desperation that cut through the years. It was the voice of Dale Gilbertson. Dale was the chief of police in a small town in Wisconsin called French Landing. Years ago, he had been a young, eager detective who had worked under Jack in Los Angeles. Jack had been his mentor, his hero. Dale had left the chaos of the big city for a quieter life, for a place where the worst crime was usually a bar fight on a Saturday night. "Jack," Dale said, his voice cracking, "I need you. We've got something here. Something bad. I'm out of my league. Everyone is." Jack felt an immediate instinctual resistance. He didn't want to get involved. He was done with all that. "What kind of something, Dale?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "A killer," Dale said, and then he hesitated. "Jack, it's the kind of thing you see in nightmares. We're calling him the Fisherman." And so Dale Gilbertson told him the story that would pull Jack Sawyer out of his carefully constructed piece and send him hurtling back toward the truth he had spent 20 years denying. The town of French Landing, Wisconsin, was, on the surface, a perfect slice of American life. It was a small, picturesque town nestled in a river valley, surrounded by rolling hills and deep forests. Its main industry was a local brewery, and the whole town had a pleasant, sleepy feel to it. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where everyone knew their neighbors. It was a good place, until the Fisherman came. The first victim was a little girl named Irma Freneau. She had vanished from a town picnic. The entire community had turned out to search for her, combing the woods and the riverbanks. They found her a week later in an abandoned shack on the edge of town. What was left of her? Dale's voice faltered as he described the scene. The killer had done more than just murder her. He had eaten parts of her. The coroner's report was clinical, but the implication was monstrous: cannibalism. And there was a note left at the scene, written in a shaky, childish scrawl. It said, "I did it for Mr. Munchen." The town was plunged into a state of shock and terror. Doors were locked. Children were kept inside after school. A curfew was imposed. The idyllic peace of French Landing was shattered. The state police were called in. The FBI sent a consultant, but they had nothing. No suspects, no leads, no evidence. The killer was a ghost. Then a month later, it happened again. A young boy this time, named Edward Marshall. He disappeared on his way home from a friend's house. The pattern was the same: the frantic search, the growing dread, and then the discovery. He was found in a different abandoned building, and the crime scene was just as horrific. Again, parts of the body had been consumed, and again there was a note with the same childish handwriting. This one said, "Mr. Munchen is pleased." Fear in French Landing curdled into full-blown panic. The town was under siege by a monster. The local police force, led by Dale Gilbertson, was overwhelmed. They were good cops, used to dealing with traffic violations and the occasional domestic dispute. They were not equipped to hunt a cannibalistic child murderer who moved like a phantom. Dale was at his breaking point. His town was terrified, his officers were exhausted, and he had no answers. So he had made the call. He had called the one man he knew, who had a reputation for solving the unsolvable. He had called his old boss, Jack Sawyer. Jack listened to the whole story, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at him to say no, to hang up the phone, to go back to his garden and his quiet life. This was exactly the kind of darkness he had retired to escape. But as Dale spoke, Jack could hear the ghosts of his past whispering to him. He could hear the echo of his own quest, of his own journey into darkness to save someone he loved. He heard the desperation in Dale's voice, the plea for help from a good man who was drowning. He knew he couldn't refuse. His sense of duty, the part of him that was still a cop, was too strong. And there was another, deeper reason, a reason he wouldn't admit even to himself. The story felt wrong. It felt incomplete. The detail about the notes, about this Mr. Munchen, it felt like a piece from a different puzzle, a puzzle he dimly remembered working on a long, long time ago. "I'll be on the next flight," Jack said, and as the words left his mouth he felt a sense of grim finality. He was stepping back into the world of shadows. A few days later, Jack Sawyer arrived in French Landing. The town was even more beautiful than Dale had described, but the beauty was a lie. Underneath the quaint storefronts and the brightly colored autumn leaves, there was a palpable current of fear. He saw it in the way people looked over their shoulders, in the way mothers clutched their children's hands a little too tightly. The monster was not just in the woods, it was in the hearts and minds of everyone who lived there. Dale Gilbertson met him at the small municipal airport. He had aged. The cheerful, confident young detective Jack remembered was gone, replaced by a grey, exhausted man with dark circles under his eyes. They drove to the police station, and Dale laid out the case files. Jack spent hours poring over the documents, the crime scene photos, the witness statements. The pictures were horrific, but Jack forced himself to look at them with a professional detachment. He was a homicide cop again. He was looking for a pattern, for a mistake, for any small detail that would give him a way in. The case was a fortress. The killer was incredibly careful or incredibly lucky. There was no physical evidence at either scene, no fibers, no footprints, no DNA that didn't belong to the victims. The only witnesses were a few people who had seen a strange old man near the areas where the children had disappeared. Their descriptions were vague and contradictory. Some said he was tall, some said he was short, some said he had a white car, some said it was blue. The only thing they agreed on was that he was old and had long, straggly grey hair. It was not enough to go on. The investigation was going nowhere. The state police and the FBI were treating it as a standard, albeit unusually brutal, serial killer case. They were building a profile, a disorganized predatory pedophile, likely a local, someone who knew the area. But it didn't feel right to Jack. The killer was disorganized in the savagery of the attacks, but he was incredibly organized in his ability to leave no trace. It was a contradiction. And there was the cannibalism. It was rare, and when it did happen, it was usually part of a specific ritual. But there was no ritual here, just a horrifying, almost animalistic consumption. It was as if the killer was not just murdering these children, but feeding on them. Jack began his own investigation, re-interviewing witnesses, visiting the crime scenes. He walked the woods where Irma Freneau had been found. The shack was just a collapsing ruin of rotting wood. The police had taken everything of evidentiary value, but Jack wasn't looking for evidence. He was looking for a feeling. He stood in the center of the small, dark room, closed his eyes, and let the Sawyer glimmer, the old intuition, take over. The air was cold and still, but underneath the smell of mildew and decay, he could smell something else, a faint, coppery scent, like old pennies and blood, and something else too, a smell like burnt electricity. It was a smell he recognized, a smell that came from the deepest, most tightly locked part of his memory. It was the smell of a place where the walls between the worlds were thin. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. It was his imagination. It was the power of suggestion. He was tired from the flight. He was letting the horror of the case get to him. He was a cop. He dealt with facts, but the feeling lingered. Dale suggested Jack talk to a local man named Henry Layden. Henry was a retired radio announcer who was now a local celebrity. He was blind, but he had an incredible sense of hearing and smell. He knew everyone and everything that went on in French Landing. The townspeople called him the Wisconsin Rat. Dale thought Henry might have heard or smelled something that could help. Jack agreed, though he was skeptical. Henry Layden lived in a neat, orderly house that was a monument to his other senses. Everything was meticulously arranged so he could find it by touch. The air smelled of lemon polish and old books. Henry himself was a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and a pair of dark glasses. He had a deep, resonant voice, the kind of voice that was made for radio. He was also incredibly intelligent, with a mind that was as sharp as a razor. Jack explained the case to him. Henry listened patiently, his head cocked to one side, as if he were listening to a piece of music. When Jack was finished, Henry was silent for a long time. "I have heard him," Henry said finally, his voice a low rumble. "I have not seen him, of course, but I have heard his car. It has a distinctive engine knock. And I have smelled him." "What does he smell like?" Jack asked, leaning forward. "He smells of oranges," Henry said. "Old, rotting oranges, and something else. Something burned. It is a very bad smell." He paused. "I have also heard him talking, to himself. He talks about pleasing someone, a Mr. Munchin." The name again. It sent a chill down Jack's spine. "Have you heard the killer's voice?" "No," Henry said. "Just the one, the old one. But there is another person involved. I can feel him. He is the one who smells of the rot. The old man is just the tool, the one who drives the car." Jack felt a growing sense of unease. This was getting stranger and stranger. He was used to dealing with one killer at a time. The idea of a partnership, of a strange, smelly entity that no one could see, it was straying too far from the path of logic. But he couldn't dismiss Henry. There was a certainty in the blind man's voice that was impossible to ignore. Henry was perceiving things on a different level, a level that Jack was beginning to dimly remember. The cracks in Jack Sawyer's carefully constructed reality were beginning to show. A few nights later, he had a dream. He was a boy again, running through a vast forest of impossibly large trees under a violet sky with 2 moons. He was running with a friend, a tall, gentle boy with shaggy hair. He could hear his friend's laughter. The dream was so vivid, so real, that when he woke up, his cheeks were wet with tears. He had not thought of Wolf in years. He had not allowed himself to. The grief was still there, a dull, heavy ache in his chest. He spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling of his motel room, his heart pounding, the memories threatening to come flooding back. The next day, the fisherman struck again. A third child, a little girl, was taken. This time, there was a witness. A woman who lived near the park where the girl was last seen had heard a scream. She had looked out her window and had seen an old man with long grey hair forcing the girl into an old, beat-up car. She had called the police immediately. Dale and his team, with Jack at their side, responded instantly. They set up roadblocks. They had him trapped. The car was spotted on a rural road heading out of town. A high-speed chase began. Jack was in the lead car with Dale. They raced through the Wisconsin countryside, their sirens screaming. They could see the killer's car ahead of them, a rusty old sedan. They were closing the distance. They were going to get him. But then something impossible happened. The car in front of them swerved and drove straight into an old, abandoned brewery at the side of the road. It didn't crash through the wall, it just drove into it. For a split second, the brick wall seemed to turn to smoke and the car passed through it as if it weren't there. Then the wall was solid again. Dale slammed on the brakes, his face a mask of disbelief. "What the hell was that?" he yelled. "Did you see that?" Jack had seen it, and he had understood it. It was not a trick of the light. It was a flip. The killer had just driven his car from their world into the territories. The cold dread that had been building in Jack's stomach for days finally crystallized into a terrible, absolute certainty. The box in his mind, the one he had kept locked for 20 years, burst open. The memories came back, not as a dream, but as a tidal wave of truth. The territories, the Talisman, Morgan of Orris, Wolf. It was all real. It had all happened. He looked at Dale's stunned, confused face. He looked at the solid brick wall of the old brewery. He knew that the man they were hunting was not just a man. He was a servant of a much darker power, a power from another world. He knew that the strange smells, the impossible disappearances, the car driving through a wall, it all made a terrible kind of sense. The profile the FBI had built was useless. They were hunting for a human monster, but the thing killing the children of French Landing was not human at all. Jack Sawyer got out of the car and walked toward the brewery wall. He put his hand on the rough, weathered bricks. They were solid. They were real. But he knew that just on the other side of them was another place, a place he knew intimately. He could almost feel the hum of its magic against his palm. He had spent half his life running from this truth, pretending it didn't exist. But now, it had found him. It had followed him to this quiet little town in Wisconsin. He had come to French Landing as a retired homicide detective, a man of logic and reason, to help an old friend solve a difficult case. But he knew now that the case could not be solved by a cop. It could not be solved with evidence and procedure. The monster they were hunting did not play by the rules of his world. To catch it, he would have to break those rules too. He would have to stop being just Jack Sawyer, the retired cop. He would have to remember how to be Jack Sawyer, the traveler. He would have to reawaken the magic he had tried so hard to kill. The sleeping hero had been woken by a nightmare, and he knew, with a grim and heavy heart, that his journey into the territories was not over. It was about to begin all over again. Chapter 5: The Black House and the King's Shadow. The revelation at the old brewery changed everything for Jack. The wall of denial he had so carefully constructed over 2 decades had been shattered. The truth of his past, of the territories, of his own unique nature, came rushing back in, and it was as terrifying and awe-inspiring as it had been when he was 12 years old. He was not going crazy. The world was. Or rather, it was far, far stranger than he had allowed himself to believe. He stood before that solid brick wall, the place where a car had vanished into thin air, and he was no longer just a retired cop. He was the traveller, and he had a job to do. Explaining this to Dale Gilbertson was another matter entirely. How do you tell your sane, rational, small-town police chief friend that the child killer they're hunting is from a parallel dimension? Jack tried. He took Dale to a quiet diner, sat him down with a cup of coffee, and laid it all out. He spoke of the territories, of Twinners, of his childhood quest for the Talisman. He watched Dale's face go from confusion to concern, to a kind of gentle pity. Dale thought Jack had finally snapped under the pressure. He suggested Jack get some rest, maybe see a doctor. It was the same reaction Richard Sloat had had all those years ago. Jack knew, just as he had known then, that words were not enough. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. His first thought was of Richard, his old friend who had shared the end of that first, terrible journey. But Richard was 1,000 miles away, a successful and well-adjusted adult. Dragging him back into this nightmare felt wrong. Jack's mind then turned to the only other people in French Landing who seemed to be touching the edges of this strange reality: the blind visionary Henry Layden and a group of local bikers who called themselves the Thunder Five. The bikers, led by a man named Beezer, were rough around the edges, but Dale had told Jack they were good men at heart. More importantly, they were fiercely protective of their town, and one of their own had a connection to the case. One of the victims, little Irma Freneau, had been the daughter of a former member of their group. They wanted justice, and they were not bound by the strict rules of police procedure. Jack decided to bring them all together. He arranged a meeting at Henry Layden's house. It was a strange gathering. Dale, the stressed-out chief of police. Henry, the blind sage, sitting calmly in his armchair. And the 4 remaining members of the Thunder Five, Beezer, Mouse, Doc, and Kaiser Bill, big, bearded men in leather vests who looked profoundly out of place in Henry's neat, polished living room. Jack stood before them, the focus of their skeptical, worried, and in the biker's case, hostile stares. He didn't try to explain the whole story this time. He just told them what he knew, for sure. He told them the killer was not one person but 2. An old man who drove a car, and a controlling presence, the one, Henry, could smell the real monster. He told them that this killer could move in ways they couldn't understand, that he could disappear, that he wasn't playing by the rules of their world. He told them that to catch him, they had to be willing to believe in the impossible. The bikers were ready to dismiss him as a crazy city cop until Henry spoke. "He's telling the truth," Henry said, his deep voice filling the quiet room. "There is a wrongness in the air of this town, a tear in the world. I cannot see it, but I can feel it. This man, Jack Sawyer, he can feel it too." Henry's word carried immense weight. He was respected. His endorsement gave Jack the sliver of credibility he needed. The bikers, fueled by a desire for revenge and a deep trust in Henry, agreed to help. Dale, still deeply skeptical but also desperate and out of options, agreed to look the other way, to give Jack and his strange new posse the space to operate outside the official investigation. They were a motley crew, a fellowship of the strange, a retired cop who could travel between worlds, a blind man who could see the truth, and a biker gang ready to go to war with a monster. Their first task was to identify the old man, the driver. Henry's description of the car's engine knock was their only real clue. Doc, the mechanic of the Thunder 5, knew every car in the county. He and Jack spent days driving the back roads, listening until they heard it. A distinctive, sickly clatter coming from a rusty sedan parked outside a rundown nursing home on the edge of town. The place was called the Maxton Elder Care Facility. They had found the killer's lair. Jack and the bikers put the place under surveillance. They quickly identified their man, an elderly resident named Charles Burnside. He fit the vague witness descriptions. He was old, with long, stringy white hair, and he had a vacant, senile look in his eyes. He seemed harmless, a confused old man in the final stages of dementia. But Jack knew that was a facade. Inside that frail body was a deep and ancient evil. They learned that Burnside would occasionally be signed out of the facility by a social worker who would then return him hours later. This social worker, they realized, had to be the other half of the killing team, the one pulling the strings, but no one had ever gotten a clear look at him. Jack knew he couldn't wait for the killer to strike again. He had to force a confrontation. He had to go back to the place where the worlds had bled together, the old brewery. He had to reawaken his ability to flip, an ability he had not used in 2 decades. It was like a muscle he hadn't exercised, and he was terrified it had atrophied completely. He went to the brewery alone one night. He stood before the brick wall, the place where he had seen the car disappear. He closed his eyes. He tried to remember the feeling, the pulling sensation, the shimmer in the air. He held a coin from his pocket, a familiar object from his own world, and tried to push, to feel the other side. Nothing happened. He tried again, concentrating with all his might, dredging up the memories of his childhood, of the territories. Still nothing. The magic was dormant, buried under 20 years of denial. Frustration and fear began to well up inside him. What if he couldn't do it? What if he had lost the ability forever? He thought of the children. He thought of their terrified faces. He thought of the monster that was still out there, hiding, waiting. A surge of pure, cold rage went through him. It was a protective fury, the same feeling he'd had when he'd seen Reverend Gardner tormenting Wolf. That anger, that righteous fire was the key. He felt a flicker, a tiny spark of the old magic. The air in front of him wavered, just for a second. It wasn't a full flip, but it was a start. He knew now that he could do it. The ability was still there. He just had to find the right way to unlock it. The opportunity came a few days later. The bikers watching the nursing home saw Burnside being signed out. They followed him at a distance. Burnside didn't go far. He drove to a patch of woods not far from town and parked. Jack and Beezer crept closer, hiding in the trees watching. They saw Burnside get out of the car, and then they saw the other one. He seemed to shimmer into existence next to the old man. He was tall and impossibly thin, wearing a ridiculous orange coat and a hat. His face was long and pale, with eyes that were too big and perfectly round, like black buttons. It was a cartoon character's face, but there was nothing funny about it. It was a mask of pure, predatory evil. This was the creature Henry had smelled. This was the real Fisherman. This was Mr. Munchan. Jack watched as the creature seemed to merge with Charles Burnside. The old man's posture changed. He stood up straighter, his vacant eyes now glowing with a malevolent intelligence. The monster was wearing the old man's body like a suit. The possessed Burnside then began to walk into the woods, toward a small, hidden cabin. Jack knew that the last victim, the little girl from the park, was likely in there. He had to act. "We're going in," Jack whispered to Beezer. He told the other bikers over their walkie-talkies to create a diversion on the main road, to draw away any police who might be in the area. This had to be handled their way. Jack and Beezer stormed the cabin. Burnside, or the thing inside him, was there. He was not surprised to see them. He laughed, a high, cackling sound that came from the old man's throat, but didn't belong to him. The little girl was there, tied to a chair, terrified but alive. The creature was a sadist. It liked to draw out the fear. A brutal fight erupted. Burnside, possessed by the otherworldly entity, had superhuman strength. He threw Beezer across the room like a doll. Jack fought with the desperation of a man who knew he was all that stood between a child and a monster. During the fight, Jack grabbed an old iron poker from the fireplace. As Burnside lunged at him, Jack concentrated, pouring all his rage and his will into the piece of metal, trying to feel the territories. He swung the poker, and as it connected with Burnside's shoulder, the air shimmered violently. For a split second, the cabin was gone, and they were standing in a dark, twisted forest under a violet sky. Jack had flipped them both. The change in environment was jarring. Mr. Munchan, temporarily disoriented, shrieked in rage. The brief distraction was all Jack needed. He tackled Burnside and they both went tumbling back through the shimmering veil, landing hard on the cabin floor. The little girl was screaming. Beezer, shaking his head to clear it, got to his feet. Together, he and Jack managed to subdue the thrashing old man. They tied him up securely. The little girl was safe, but it wasn't over. They had the vessel, but the evil entity, Mr. Munchan, was still there, trapped inside, whispering threats and promises in its high, chittering voice. And Jack knew that Mr. Munchan was just a servant, a foot soldier for a much greater power. Through the creature's panicked ramblings, Jack heard a name that made his blood run cold, the Crimson King. He had heard that name once before, a long time ago, whispered in the territories. The Crimson King was a being of immense, cosmic evil, a dark god whose goal was not just to conquer worlds, but to unmake them, to tear down the dark tower that held all of reality together and return everything to the primordial chaos from which it came. Morgan of Orris had been a pawn of the Crimson King, and now this new evil, this Fisherman, was another. This wasn't just about a few murders in a small Wisconsin town. This was a battle in a much larger war, a war for the fate of all worlds. Mr. Munchan's plan was not just to kill children. He was feeding on their sorrow, their pain, their life force, but he was also looking for a special child, a powerful psychic, one he could use as a weapon to help break the beams that held up the dark tower. He was a scout and a recruiter for the armies of the Crimson King. Jack knew what he had to do. He couldn't just hand Burnside over to the police. The evil inside him had to be dealt with, and it had to be dealt with on its own turf. He had to go to the place where Mr. Munchan's power was concentrated. He had to go to the Black House. The Black House was a local legend in French Landing, a place children dared each other to go near. It was a strange, ominous house deep in the woods, painted a dull, lightless black. It was said to be haunted, a place of profound evil. Jack now understood that it was more than haunted. It was a doorway, a nexus point between the worlds, a cancer that had grown on the border of French Landing and the territories. It was Mr. Munchen's base of operations, and it was where he was taking the essence of the children he killed. The final journey began. Jack, Henry Layden, and the Thunder Five prepared for their assault on the heart of darkness. Dale, now a reluctant believer after hearing Beeza's wild-eyed story of the fight in the cabin, provided them with weapons and a promise to keep the other authorities away. They drove as close as they could to the Black House and then proceeded on foot, a strange army marching into a dark fairy tale. The woods around the Black House were wrong. The trees were twisted and diseased, their branches like skeletal claws. The air was cold and smelled of decay. There was a profound silence, the kind that comes from an absence of all life. Even the bikers, tough, hardened men, were unnerved. As they got closer, they could see the house. It was bigger than the legends described, a monstrous, sprawling structure that seemed to soak up the light around it. It did not look like it had been built. It looked like it had grown there, a malignant tumor on the face of the earth. Jack knew he had to go inside. This was his fight. He told the others to stand guard, to stop anything that tried to get out. Henry, however, insisted on going with him. "My eyes are of no use here," the blind man said, a grim smile on his face. "But my other senses may be. I will be your guide in the darkness, Jack." Jack and Henry entered the Black House. The inside was a violation of sanity. The corridors twisted at impossible angles. The rooms were filled with a strange, shifting light. The air hummed with a low, malevolent energy. They could hear whispers in the walls, the ghostly cries of the murdered children. It was a place of pure nightmare. Using Henry's incredible senses to navigate the shifting maze, they made their way deeper into the house. They were attacked by monstrous creatures, things with too many legs and mouths full of needle-sharp teeth. Jack fought them off, the skills he had learned as a boy coming back to him, his movements quick and sure. They finally reached the center of the house, a vast, cavernous room. In the middle of the room, on a throne of what looked like fused bones, sat the true form of Mr. Munchen. It was not the thin man in the orange coat. It was a grotesque, spider-like creature of immense size, with those same black button eyes. And chained to the wall behind him was the shriveled, dying form of Charles Burnside, the life force almost completely drained from him. "Traveler!" the creature hissed, its voice a chorus of 1,000 screaming insects. "You are too late! The king will have his prize!" The final confrontation was not a physical battle, it was a battle of wills. Mr. Munchen tried to invade Jack's mind, to show him visions of his greatest fears, his mother dying again, Wolf's body lying on the ballroom floor, the faces of all the murder victims he had ever seen. He tried to break Jack with sorrow and despair, but Jack was no longer the scared boy from the Agincourt Hotel. He was a man who had faced darkness and had chosen the light. He had spent 20 years trying to forget his past, but now he embraced it. He drew on the memory of his love for his mother, his loyalty to Wolf, his duty as a protector. He drew on the power of the Talisman, a power that still resided deep within him, a spark of pure, healing light. He focused that light, that goodness, into a single point and pushed it out at the creature. Mr. Munchen shrieked, a sound of agony and disbelief. The creature's pure, ancient evil could not stand against the simple, powerful force of human love and courage. The spider-like form began to smoke and dissolve, collapsing in on itself like a dying star. With a final, deafening roar of psychic energy, the creature was gone. The Black House began to fall apart around them. The walls shook. The ceiling crumbled. The nightmare was collapsing. Jack freed the dying Charles Burnside from his chains and, with Henry's help, they half carried, half dragged him out of the house, just as the entire structure imploded, sinking into the ground and leaving nothing behind but a foul-smelling pit. Back in the woods, the bikers were waiting. They had fought off their own share of smaller creatures that had poured out of the house in its death throes. They were battered and bruised, but they were alive. Charles Burnside died a few moments later, a final peaceful breath escaping his lips as the last vestiges of the monster's control left him. He was just a sad old man at the end. The nightmare was over. The fisherman was gone. The wrongness that had settled over French Landing lifted like a fever breaking. Jack Sawyer had done it again. He had faced a monster from the territories and sent it back to the hell it came from. He did not stay long in French Landing. He had no desire to be a hero, to answer the endless questions that would surely come. He said his goodbyes to Dale, to Henry, and to his unlikely allies, the Thunder Five. He got in his car and drove west back toward his quiet life in California. But he knew things would never be the same. He could no longer pretend. He could no longer hide from what he was. He was Jack Sawyer, the traveler. He was a guardian of the borderlands, a soldier in a secret war. He had accepted both halves of his identity, the cop and the magician, and had found a strange kind of peace in the union. He drove into the setting sun, knowing that his retirement was over. The worlds were vast, and the shadow of the Crimson King was long, and there would always be more monsters to fight.